So today, we're going to talk about the faithfulness, trusting in God in all seasons. And I just want to thank the worship team this morning for just an amazing worship set that really set the stage for this message this morning. So, as we are staring down the end of 2024 and staring into the face of 2025, we have to remember that all our life, He has been faithful. All our lives, He has been so good. Now, I know that as we sit here today in this reflective mode, like we're getting ready to think about this new year and thinking back on what's happened in the past, the good, the bad, the ugly. And some of us, if we're to be honest this morning, some of us are limping into the new year. Some of us are struggling with deep things, some deep hurts, some deep sorrow, some deep frustration. Some of us have lost jobs, or are stressing over finances, or all these different things that we're hanging on to in 2024. And yet, the hope of 2025 draws near. Now, no matter where you are on the spectrum of things, of feelings and life experiences, no matter what baggage it is you're bringing from 2024 forward into 2025, as Christians, we can trust in the faithfulness of God in all seasons, whether those seasons are stormy or sunny. All my life, you have been so good. Now, I think we can all agree that it's easiest to trust God when life's going well. But it takes a deeper faith to weather all seasons of life. It takes a life grounded in the Word of God and in prayer. In the toughest seasons, we truly need to know God, not just know of God. See, God knows that stuff is going to happen to us. Tough stuff. We are not shielded as Christians from the difficulties of life. Jesus reminds us in John 16:33, in this world you will have tribulation. Not you may, you will have tribulation, but take heart. I have overcome the world. Take heart, he says. It's like he was reminding us not to lose hope. We need to keep our eyes fixed on him as we enter this new year. We need to reflect on his faithfulness in years gone by. Take heart. He is for us. He is with us. He has overcome. So, this morning, what do we do with tough seasons in our lives? What do we do with the hurts? What do we do with the frustrations, the fears? God, what do we do with all that stuff as we drag it forward into a new year? How can we look to a new year with hope when we're still reeling on last year's trials? Today, I would invite you this morning to turn with me into the book of Lamentations to see how a prophet Jeremiah dealt with sorrow and fear, how he could have hope during some very tough times. So we're going to look at the first part of Lamentations. We're going to be in chapter 3, verses 1 to 23 this morning. So here, the author, probably Jeremiah, some scholars wonder, but most agree that it's probably Jeremiah, laments on the past years that he's lived. These years have been tough, full of terrible things. In fact, it might have been some of the worst years he had probably ever seen. Jeremiah laments here in the aftermath of incredible sorrow and incredible loss experienced by Israel. His emotions run deep and overwhelm him. Now, at this time, Israel was in some deep sin, and God sent Jeremiah to call them out, to call them back. He called them to repent and turn back to God. However, Israel did not heed his warnings. He writes of the unspeakable horrors and starvation and cruelty that the people suffered in the Babylonian siege leading up to the capture of Jerusalem. It's tough stuff to read. We're going to read it in just a moment, and you'll hear and feel the raw emotion. But yet, as he laments, as he wrestles with all those emotions, Jeremiah reminds us that God is faithful each and every day. Not that bad things will never happen, but he is faithful to get us through each and every day. Every day we rise, God is taking care of us. His grace and strength and love go before us, and he will guide and sustain us throughout all seasons of our lives. We find here a reminder of how we can deal with dark times as we look toward the future. So let's read of his lament. Reading from Lamentations 3, 1-18, it says, and just listen and feel, and as you read this, just think about where he's at. He says, I am a man who has seen affliction under the rod of his wrath. He has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. Surely against me he turns his hands again and again the whole day long. He has made my flesh and my skin waste away. He has broken my bones. He has besieged and enveloped me with bitterness and tribulation. He has made me dwell in darkness like the dead of long ago. He has walled me about so that I cannot escape. He has made my chains heavy. Though I call and cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. He has blocked my ways with blocks of stone. He has made my paths crooked. He is a bear lying in wait for me, a lion in hiding. He turned aside my steps, and he tore me into pieces. He has made me desolate. He bent his bow and set me as a target for his arrows. He drove into my kidneys the arrows of his quiver. I have become a laughingstock to all people, the object of their taunts all day long. He has filled me with bitterness. He has sated me with wormwood. He has made my teeth grind on gravel and made me cower in ashes. My soul is bereft of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is. So I say, my endurance has perished. So has my hope from the Lord. Can you feel the raw emotions and feelings that are welling up within Jeremiah? He expresses his personal anguish and collective pain for his nation. Can you feel the depth of that pain as he cries out to the Lord? He describes himself as a man deeply afflicted with darkness and entrapment and isolation. Jeremiah feels forsaken and he feels overwhelmed. His sense of abandonment is palatable, and he laments that even his prayers seem unheard, which just deepen his despair. So what do you do with heaviness from the past? Perhaps today you are sitting here and you can relate to Jeremiah and his lament. Perhaps today you too feel abandoned by God, left in darkness to find your way. Your hope is buried deep, and you are worn out and just plumb tired. You are on the downward swing of emotions, afraid of the future, and are sitting here looking at this new year saying, now what's next? These questions, these feelings are not new. Life is tough for everyone at some point, at some season, at some different time. But in all of this, how can you have hope for the new year? Hope for tomorrow. So the year was 1866. In a log cabin in a tiny town of Franklin, Kentucky, Thomas Obadiah Chisholm was born. Although he had never attended high school or college, he became an elementary school teacher at the ripe old age of 15 years old. Or 16, excuse me. He was even older than that. 16. 5 years later, he was named the local newspaper's associate editor of the Franklin Favorite. When he was 27, he attended a revival service led by Dr. H.C. Morrison and gave his heart to Christ. He served as a Methodist minister and later as an insurance agent. He was never in good health and was often an invalid. Yet during his lifetime, he wrote over 1,200 poems. And in 1923, he sent a batch of those poems to William Runyon, who was a musician who served at the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago. On a trip to Kansas, Mr. Runyon took those poems and read them. One of them impressed him so much that he set it to music. And he published it privately, little knowing it would become one of the most beloved hymns of the 20th century. In 1954, George Beverly Shea introduced it to Great Britain during one of Billy Graham's crusades in London. Late in life, Thomas Obadiah Chisholm penned these words of personal testimony. He says, "My income has not been large at any time due to impaired health in the earlier years which has followed me to now." His lament. But listen to what he writes next. "Although I must not fail to record here the unfailing unfaithfulness of a covenant-keeping God, that he has given me many wonderful displays of his providing care, for which I am filled with astonishing gratefulness." Astonishing gratefulness. Here in his lament of his own, yet that phrase, astonishing gratefulness, should that not be the testimony of every believer? The hymn he wrote, "As great is thy faithfulness." He knew more than just God's name. He knew how God had moved in the past. He knew of his unfailing faithfulness. Continuing on in Lamentations in 3:21 to 23, at the end of this section, Lament, Jeremiah writes, "But this I call to mind." Hang on to that. "But this I call to mind, therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness." Jeremiah cries out, describing Israel's pain and weeping. He writes something here, though, that shines brightly. He seems to land on how we can rely on God throughout our life journey through the tough times. And this is so appropriate for us as we reflect on the coming year and we reflect on the past year. We need to remember. We need to remember. This I call to mind. What God has done for us in the past provides us for hope for the future. He writes, "His mercies never come to an end. Great is thy faithfulness." Thomas Chisholm says it this way: "Great is thy faithfulness, O God my Father. There is no shadow of turning with thee. Thou changest not, thy compassions, they fail not. As thou hast been, thou forever will be." Joni Eareckson Tada, in her book, When God Weeps, reminds us, never doubt in the darkness what you once believed in the light. Let me say that again. Never doubt in the darkness what you once believed in the light. When darkness settles in to stay and dark and brooding skepticism surges over us like a tide of doubt and fear, the only sure dike, she says, against the flood of emotions and feelings is memory. We must recall sunnier times when we lived on his blessings and knew his favor. Jeremiah points out that by calling to mind God's faithfulness in the past, we have hope anew each and every morning. When we remember God's faithfulness in times of trouble, when we remember God's faithfulness when we weep and when we mourn, when we remember God's faithfulness in the fear and anxiety, we can hold on to him in those future situations. So we need to reflect. We need to remember. But yet, I think we sometimes struggle with that. I think we sometimes struggle with long-term memory in the toughest of seasons. Do we not? We often fail to remember God's faithfulness in the past. Our perspective gets blurry because of the problems we're currently facing, and we forget that we've gone through similar or even worse things in the past. The looming mountain before us of problems looks so big that we momentarily fail to realize all the other mountains we've already faced and overcome with the help of God. That's why we need to remember. We need to bring to mind how faithful God has been to us in the past. Jeremiah reminds us in verse 21, "But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope." Jeremiah was able to reflect, thinking beyond the current strife and fear and sadness. He could remember the faithfulness of God in other circumstances of his life. When Paul wrote his second letter to Timothy, the younger man was facing one of the biggest mountains of his life. Believers were being persecuted and even dying for their faith. And in the midst of this panic, Timothy was afraid. He must have been wondering, God, are you going to see me through this terrible hour? So in 2 Timothy 1-5, Paul told Timothy, he says, I'm reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first with your grandmother Lois, your mother Eunice, and now, I'm sure, dwells in you as well. Paul was reminding Timothy about something very important here. See, God's faithfulness was a part of Timothy's family's heritage. His grandmother trusted the Lord, and the Lord never failed to let her down. His mother trusted in the Lord, never failed to let her down either. Because Timothy was dealing with great stress and difficulty, Paul took the opportunity to remind him that just as God had never failed his grandmother or mother, neither would he abandon Timothy in this difficult hour. Perhaps today you are dealing with difficult hours in front of you, and you are wondering, how am I going to get through? Think of the past. Think where God has worked before. Think of the men and women in your lives who have stood strong in times of adversity, you can look to as a reminder of how God is faithful. Please, we should never forget what God has already done for us. We need to reflect back on the ways that God has been with us throughout our life's journeys. Those memories, when you think of them, will stir you up, will encourage you to face a present dilemma with faith. And just as God has always been faithful to you in the past, he will be faithful to you as you move into a new year. And this we must not forget. Never forget how God has healed you. Never forget how he has delivered you or saved you. Never forget how he has guided and directed you, brought you through difficult trials, provided for you during hard financial times, protected you and your family. Never forget. In the years gone by, the Israelites were known to pile up stones, these things they called standing stones. These rock piles served as tangible reminders of God's faithfulness and of his mighty works. These stones were often set in places where God had performed miracles or fulfilled his promises, such as like the crossing of the Jordan River. Serving as a visual marker, they helped future generations remember and reflect on God's unwavering presence and his faithfulness. Whenever they walked by these standing stones, they could say, let me tell you how our God was faithful to us right here. And in a culture reliant on oral traditions, those stones reinforced a collective memory, inspiring gratitude and trust in God in times of trial. They stood as physical symbols of spiritual truths, encouraging the Israelites to remain faithful to God, who had consistently demonstrated his power and love. So, what are those standing stones in your life? Those places where God has moved and been faithful, that you can point to and say, right here, God did this for me in my life. He was faithful. When times are dark, you can look to these event markers and know that God was faithful then and be reminded of his faithfulness to you for the future. No matter what you have gone through, what hurts you are holding, what fears you are hanging on to, remember, God's faithful to you, and he will be faithful to you tomorrow, no matter what you face. He has been faithful to you in the past, so you can trust him with your future. So there's a story about a little boy who had been invited to a birthday party. He was so excited to go to this birthday party, and he started counting the days, till the birthday party. But the morning of the party, when the little boy woke up, he bounded to the window, and he looked out the window, and he was shocked to look outside and see that a blizzard had struck his little town. The snow was coming down in buckets. Wind was blowing, and it was howling outside. And his dad came to him, and he said, son, I don't think you should go to the party today. The weather's too bad outside. The boy was so disappointed. And so he did what all kids do when they're told no, right? Please, 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 can I go? Please, 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 please. He begged and begged. And finally, much to his surprise, his dad finally said, okay, you can go to the party. So the little boy bundled up in a hat and a coat and mittens and started down the street to his friend's house. And when he got to the door, he turned around and saw his father turning to go back to the home. It was then that he realized that his father had been walking behind him all the way to make sure he made it safely. There may be times when we're dealing with tough things that we feel like we're alone, but in truth, we're always surrounded by the love and goodness of a faithful God. Even in the toughest times, God is walking beside you. He's walking behind you. He may even be carrying you. Remember, great is thy faithfulness means God's love and mercy is strong and loyal and unending. God's love and mercies aren't crushed by big things. They aren't pulled apart by little things. God's not wringing his hand wondering what he's going to do with the present situation that you're dealing with. He knows. He's not wondering. He knows. He is saying, I am with you. I love you. Keep your eyes on me. I'll help you get through. I'll carry you. I'll walk beside you. Your flaws and failures aren't straining God's love. In the good and the bad and the ugly, God has been and will always be faithful. Know that your sins are not pulling God's mercy apart. When we come to God and confess our sin, God has mercy on us. Believe this within your heart. Believe with all your heart in his faithfulness. Jeremiah did, but I call this to mind, therefore I have hope. So, looking at the faithfulness of God allows us to have hope for the future. Jeremiah says in verse 22, 23, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies, they never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. And yet sometimes, I think, we get stuck. We get stuck in the past. We get stuck in past hurts and past trials and past issues. Maybe today you are thinking, well, I might be stuck. Are you unable to move forward into the hope of a new-filled tomorrow because of past hurts or habits or hang-ups that you're hanging on to? Are you hanging on to fear and anxiety, bad relationships, the woe of sickness? Are you stuck, unable to see a bright tomorrow or feel God's love and care for you today? I have found that when we are stuck, when I have been stuck, we often move into negative self-talk. Now, I don't know if you experience that. Did anybody here experience negative self-talk? You hear it in your head, right? You hear it. It's like you're like spinning your wheels and getting nowhere. I think like many of you, or some of you, or maybe none of you, I don't know, but like some of you, I'm sure, you tend toward this at times. You know the words in your head that never seem to take us anywhere positive. I'm no good. I've really messed it up. I can't do this. I can't go on. Why me? All those things, right? And you replay those words of hurt and fear, and you wallow in it. You find yourself stuck in a seemingly never-ending replay of trials and struggles. Have you been there? Are you stuck on past hurts? Well, I was. In the not-too-distant past, the hurts of a situation created a place of stuckness for me. See, I recall a time when I was a child where I ended up going to a muddy field because I thought it'd be fun, and I wanted to play in the mud. And I had my big boots on, and I walked out into this muddy field, and as I got further and further into the field, I sank further and further down. And at one point, I was into my knees in mud. I was a young child at the time, and I was alone, and I was scared and unable to move. And somebody asked me last service, what happened? I can tell you, I can see it to this day. I cried out to my dad, Dad, help me. And he came running. For me, a past hurt was like being stuck in the mud. A relationship personally hurt me. And during the season, I questioned everything, including my calling as a pastor. There was no way for me to move forward, I feared. I was paralyzed. stuck in a cycle of frustration and fear and anxiety and despair. I sought help for key people in my life. I wrestled with it. I prayed, and I called out for my Father. And as I did, process over time, I found myself confronted with the words of Jesus. And these words are, do you want to be healed? Reading from John chapter 5, verses 2 through 6, get a little snippet here of what this was about. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, in Aramaic called Bethesda, which was 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, the lame, and the paralyzed, people hanging out, hoping to be healed. One man was there, had been an invalid for 38 years, lying there. And when Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he'd already been there for such a long time, he said to him, do you want to be healed? Strange question, but a profoundly important question to ask. Now, granted, my hurt was emotional, not physical, but the question still rang true for me. Did I really want to be healed? Perhaps today, you are hanging on to things from the past that have cemented you in the mud deeply. I personally needed a way forward, a direction from God. And at a retreat, I prayed and asked God to heal me of those wounds, and He did. For me, it was a miracle in my life, because literally all that stuff came sweeping out of me. And all the stuff that I held on to, I was able to release. I don't forget it, but I was able to release it and move on. God was faithful to me. And isn't it interesting, I think, that as you get unstuck, you can often see more clearly the countless ways that God has been faithful throughout your life. You may not see it at the moment, but after, you can clearly see it. I was reminded of all the ways God had been faithful to me in the past. Like so many of you, I have had my own trials and own storms in my life. But as I look back, God has always been faithful to see me through them. Times when I couldn't see a way, but God made a way. My father, now in his mid-80s, and his health has been failing, but recently told my son and I of his desire to help people in the remaining years of his life. And I told him then, and I believe to this day, that it is through his life story, his testimony, where he can help the most. He has shared his testimony with the family, with friends, with anybody who will listen, really, over the years of hardship and restoration, of God's faithfulness throughout his life. When times were dark, God made a way. To this day, my dad will say, God has been faithful to me and my family my entire life. I have seen it. Not that I deserved it, but He has been faithful to me nonetheless. Not that His life was easy, not that there was never any hurt or struggles. God today is very real to him because he has seen God work in his life. And he remembers God's faithfulness to him throughout his life. And seeing God's faithfulness in this life allows him to face tomorrow, even as age begins to take its toll. Jeremiah said, "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning." Yet in our stuckness, we sometimes forget that very thing. We forget the reminder from the book of Jeremiah 29:11, which reads, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plan for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope." In the book of Lamentations, Jeremiah laments about the destruction of Israel. He saw these families who were killed and people who had been starved, and they're weeping in affliction. But in light of that, Jeremiah still had hope for the future. God was and still is faithful, loving, and merciful God throughout life. He writes in Lamentations 3:22-23 about 4 truths that give him hope for the future. He writes this. He says, God's love never ceases. His love doesn't end because you don't love him enough or love him the way you should. God's love never quits or never gives up. That's the one thing that gave Jeremiah hope. God's mercies never come to an end. God's compassion and forgiveness, it never runs out. God's mercy cannot be measured because it doesn't have a beginning and it doesn't have an end. God's mercies are new every morning. Just as the sun rises every day to usher a new day in, so God's grace will be there, and you can trust it just as you can trust the sun to rise each day. And God's faithfulness is great. God's faithfulness and promise-keeping remain intact no matter what things are going on in our lives. So do you want to be healed? If you are living in hurts and hang-ups from 24, are you ready to trust God for tomorrow? Are you ready to call out to your Father for help? Are you willing to lay that down? Can you look back on your life and see where God has been faithful to you in the past? Max Lucado asks this question. He says, do you want to get sober, solvent, educated, better? Do you want to get in shape, get over your past, get beyond your upbringing? Do you want to get stronger or healthier or happier? Are you ready for a new day, a new way, a new tomorrow? Are you ready to get unstuck? Looking back on how God has been faithful to you in the past helps you do just that. Lean on memories of victory. Lean on memories of wholeness. And remember the times that God was faithful to you so you can face the new year, a new day, the new tomorrow with hope. Know that God sees you and he hears you and will always be with you throughout your life. The hymn, Great is Thy Faithfulness, closes on these words. It says, strength for today and bright hope for tomorrow. Blessings all mine and 10,000 beside. Great is Thy faithfulness. Great is Thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, Thy hand hath provided. Great is Thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. And so today, will you reflect as Jeremiah did on God's faithfulness in the past? You know, it's always a challenge to look to the future and trust God with it because we don't know what the future is going to hold. But there's something awesome about God. He does know. He calls us to trust him as a loving father with our futures. With the new year will come new problems, new difficulties, and new troubles, I am sure. There will be new things that will happen to us, good and bad, that we could never even imagine. But we need to put our faith and trust now, daily, and throughout the year in the one who knows our lives and knows our futures from beginning to end. He who has been faithful in the past will be faithful in the year to come. This I call to mind, Jeremiah says. Therefore, I have hope. Great is Thy faithfulness. Will you pray with me? Father God, this morning we come to you with so many different emotions and feelings. There are so many different things going on in our minds. It's hard to sometimes sort them through. But God, help us as we prepare for a new year, as we bring forward the things of the past that we're struggling with, that we continue to wallow in, God. We just want to give those to you. We don't want to keep carrying them into the new year. God, help us remember your faithfulness in years gone by and help us to hang on that. Help us to remember those who have been faithful before us. Help us to look at them as standing stones in our lives, God, and saw how God was faithful to them so that we can have hope and joy in the morning. God, I thank you for the opportunity to worship today. I thank you for the opportunity to pause in our busy holiday time to come and focus on you and to thank you. Thank you, because great is Thy faithfulness.